Thank you once again for joining another episode of the Real Men Podcast. I am Don Bell. I'm joined by my other hosts, Brother Melvin Smith, Brother Orlando Hudson, Dr. Stephen Poulsen, and we are four brothers navigating through this thing called life, dealing with real issues in a real way. We admonish you to continue to follow the podcast on all of our social media outlets. You can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. You can follow us on our YouTube channel and Instagram. You can also download episodes on Spotify as well. So we are continuing the conversation. Our last conversation was about grace. And of course, when you start talking about grace, you can never confine it to just one conversation. It has to take place in multiple conversations. So we want to do at least one more, probably two or three, depending on how things go. So tonight we're going to kick things off. So Orlando, I know you came in kind of energetic, looking rather dapper with the cardigan and everything, and looking like you ready to take your pick. So I know you've had some thoughts. You were just kind of chatting on our last conversation. So what other things have you been pondering since then?
Oh man. I'm gonna start out with some questions, man. I'm gonna start out with some of the questions that were asked in the last episode, and that was lingering. Why is it so hard to give grace to loved ones? Should we allow grace to become a crutch? What's your motivation behind grace? Grace is unmerited favor that's given to us by God. So grace is not for the qualities we like and enjoy in people. These were some of the things that we left lingering the last time we met. And I have some more, because this thing is just so broad, man, and far reaching. A few questions. Are you occupying space in your life with hurt and pain that God wants to fill with joy and peace because of your unwillingness to forgive? Are you allowing hurt from unforgiveness, you extending grace, to stop your healing? Are you allowing your pain from unforgiveness, from your lack of willingness to extend grace? Are you allowing the pain from that to delay your promise?
Wow.
Is your lack of success tied to your lack of forgiveness? Have you allowed unforgiveness to place you into spiritual incarceration and halt God's purpose for your life? I'm gonna let y'all feed on that.
You on one tonight? That's what you're telling us. You on one tonight?
You just gonna come out the gate with that? That's how you
come out the gate with it. Jump in where you want to jump in on it at. It's a lot.
It is a lot, and I'm not even going to try to deal with all of it, because I was trying to write it as you said it, and it's a whole bunch to think about. And thanks for bringing it out. You may have given us some notes for the next segment of this.
Right, exactly.
But one thing that kind of spoke to me, and this is something that the Lord has really been challenging me on, is allowing, I don't know how you put it, but basically allowing what you experience to stop you from extending grace, right? You didn't say it that way, but that's how I heard it. And many times we have to be, and this is a word that we don't use in the church too often, and we definitely don't address it. But many times we have to be honest about our trauma. And there are some things that we experience that are very traumatic. We come through them, but there's still some aspects of them, of those things we experience, that live in our everyday lives. And this goes back to what we discussed the last time, where grace has to be adequately received in order to be adequately distributed. And what I realize is that there are areas in my life that I continually have to allow God to touch, and have to expose to God. And I can't just look at it as, oh, I survived it. Oh, I came through it. And, I don't look like what I've been through. That may be true. But sometimes what I've been through speaks through how I deal with people. Sometimes the fact that you've been lied to, manipulated, taken advantage of, sometimes that speaks to how you deal with people. You have trust issues. You don't allow people to get too close. You don't see people for who they truly are because you feel like everybody is hiding something. Those are some things that kind of prevent us from giving and extending people grace. And if we're not careful, we're allowing people to pay a debt for a fine that they didn't run up.
Wow.
And we're charging them that price, and it's very expensive. It's very expensive, but we're charging them that price to pay that debt that doesn't belong to them. And so when you talk about unforgiveness and coming through different things that cause these traumatic experiences, we have to make sure that we receive God's grace. Number one, to heal. Number one, to heal. And then number two, to have the proper relationships with others. So to extend grace, because here's the thing, and I'm gonna stop. Nobody deserves grace. Like when we accept that fact, it becomes easier for us. It's I'm not going to say it's easy, but it becomes easier, less difficult for us to extend grace when we understand that no one deserves it, including us.
Wow.
And when you put it like that, Steve, when you put it so simple that nobody deserves grace, including us, it causes us to look at the lens of how we issue grace differently. Because it's easy for us to get on our judgmental high horses when it comes time to extend grace, but we don't look at it through the same lens of when we needed grace. We didn't ask the Father some of the questions we ask ourselves when it comes time to extend grace to others. Well, am I going to be a crutch for this person? Am I now enabling them? And am I blocking and hindering their way? And all of those are bona fide questions. But when we are the ones that are in need of that same grace, we pray that the Father is not pondering those same types of questions in his brain. To say, am I now going to be a stumbling block for Donald? Am I now going to, and he doesn't. That's the thing. That's the wonderful thing, is he doesn't, he continues to extend the grace that we don't deserve. And so it becomes easier. It's not easy, but it becomes easier when I look at grace from the lens of the grace that I have received. It becomes easier for me to look through the lens of grace when I need to extend grace out. Because I promise you, I have even as much as I want to think that I haven't, I have received way more grace than I have had to be in a position to extend. And I'll give you a tangible example of that. He probably doesn't even remember it, but the way in which I look at helping others is a direct reflection of our brother Melvin. And I'll share. We were at a place in time, all of us have had our individual relationships with Melvin for decades. And so at one point in our life, we hit a tough financial patch. And Melvin and Linda blessed us and gave us a financial lifeline. And it was something that was to be repaid. And so it took us a little while to recover, a lot longer than we had anticipated. Quite honestly, when I got to a place where I could have paid it back, I forgot about the debt altogether. Or then when I would remember, I'd be in another stretch of where I didn't have it to make good on it. And I got to a place, I mean, it was years later. I'm talking years later. You looked up, we done took trips, we done did a whole lot of stuff. And I finally got to where I was like, you know what, I gotta return it. And made it a priority, and we repaid it. Through all of that, he never said anything, never brought it up, never held it against us, never said anything about it at all. And so the way that I now view when it comes time for me to be in that position to extend someone a lifeline, that's the lens that I view it from, because of the grace that I got years ago.
Wow.
Situation that I should not have, So yeah, it's easier to look at that. And I'm gonna say this last thing, and I'm gonna shut up. I'm probably not, but I'm gonna shut up for now. This was how I can when you can see the grace working in your life, it also changes your perspective on how you give the grace out. Today was our first fruit Sunday at our church. And when I looked at what we sowed today and were able to sow, which would have accounted for in years past, probably half a year's worth of tithes and offerings, we were able to do that in one Sunday. Wow. That's only because of grace, my whole different view on grace and sowing and faith and all of that, and how God has quickly redeemed the time, if you will, and given us grace in areas that we definitely don't deserve. So you're absolutely right. We none of us deserve the grace. And so it becomes a little easier. It's not easy, but easier to look at it differently when it comes time to give it out.
When you look at the Bible, okay, whenever Jesus was confronted with, someone that was in sin, or they had a crowd coming to him, the first thing that he did was he would tell the accusers to look at themselves, and you come up with the answer. With the the lady got caught in adultery. He was like, okay, the first one of you who is without sin, throw the first stone. And then they just started to excuse themselves. So that's what grace is all about. Grace is all about, you have to look through the lens of how much grace you have received, and I remember in my life, man, I just wanted, there were so many times that I just wanted a break. I needed a break. I needed, I may have messed up. I may have said the wrong thing. I may have done the wrong thing. I may have came across the wrong way. And I just wanted, just to be acquitted, if you will. I wanted to at least, just please don't hold that against me, And guess what? That's what God does. He extends his grace toward us so much, and I have to, when I look at others, they may be going through. And the first thing that comes to my mind, when I was in that position, I wanted somebody to reach out. When I was in that position, I wanted somebody to have mercy upon me. Not only have compassion, but compassion in action, which is mercy. I needed somebody to really, really have some mercy upon me. I just needed a break. I just needed something to help me move forward. Because if you kept my past or kept what I did in front of me, I wouldn't have made it. I wouldn't have made it. I would have had all kind of baggage. I would have had all kind of other things attached to me if I had not have received that grace. And that's the Bible, and especially with Jesus, he would tell, whenever throughout the whole scripture, a lot of times Jesus didn't answer them. He would tell them, examine yourself. Examine yourself. Look at how many times I have forgiven you. Look at how many times the Father has forgiven you. And based on that, you go ahead and make your decision, which means that we have to properly assess how much grace we have received. You have to. If you do not properly assess how much grace you have received, you cannot dish it out. And you will become judgmental. You will become
possible. God have mercy.
Go ahead, man. Go ahead.
No. I don't. You just hit me. You just dropped the bomb on me when you said assess how much grace we've used. Is that even possible?
No, there's no metrics. There's no metric system to determine, man, how much grace we have received. And we have to keep in mind that there's no reciprocity in grace. There's no quid pro quo in grace. We can't give it out with the expectance of it that it's going to be returned. We can't give it out. I'll forgive you today if in 2 weeks from now when I mess up, you forgive me. That's not how it works.
So what's your motivation? What's the motivation then? You see what I'm saying?
It's got to be glorifying God, man. Your motivation has to be doing it to the glory of God, for which is what we were created for, that purpose, man. Yeah. When you have to forgive words that can't be unspoken, forgive deeds that can't be undone, and you got to live with the consequences of that stuff, and your flesh is suffering, your flesh is vexed. It has to be to the glory for God. There can't be any you can't look at any physical or natural reasons. There isn't any.
None that makes sense.
There isn't any that's sufficient.
No.
Yeah. You have to. We have, and it's tough to get to that place, but we have to do it only to glorify God, because it's easy for us in our fleshly nature to want there to be reciprocity. We want it to be tit for tat. We want it to be, all right, I'm going to do this with the expectation that if I'm in the tight down the line, you're going to get me on the back end. And like you said, it just does not work like that. And unless we get to a place to where it's like, I really am doing this for the glory of God, so I know God's going to get the glory, and that's enough for me, it's tough. That's a tough haul if that's not the motivation. Because you won't get back. It's somebody going to let you down. Somebody going to drop the ball. Somebody is not going to look as favorably on your situation as you looked on their situation.
That's right. And wow.
Say something.
It's just they may not. When you bring it up, when you express that, hey, I did this for you, or what about when I forgave you for this? You haven't extended grace. That wasn't grace. You were merely doing business. You was conducting business. That was an exchange. You were bartering. Grace isn't to be bartered, man. When you sit there and say Melvin never bought it up, and I know it will never come up, no matter what the situation may be. That was to the glory of God.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, do we want to be like Jesus Christ in our, in our daily walk? We're supposed to be, God is fashioning us into the image of Christ. So do we really and truly want our light to so shine that Christ is shining through in our lives? Because, hey, I know it may not be useful to me, because grace is always to the help of the person that you are dishing it out to, not necessarily myself. So, but we live in a society that's all about me, my, and I. What can you do for me?
Well, we live in these fleshly bodies. We live in these fleshly bodies too, man. So it's, we wanna forgive and be like Jesus, but when your neighbor is strung out on that stuff and he's sneaking in your garage, stealing your lawnmower at night and selling it for $10, or he don't went up under the hood of your car and took your battery out and sold it for $5, and you got to get to work the next day, in these fleshly bodies, it's tough, and you have to stay prayed up. That strength that we don't have on our own, we're not going to be able to generate the strength to do that. We have to tap into a higher source.
Right.
We have to.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't want our audience to hear this and think that we're saying, and I think Don and I both have kind of said this, it's not easy. This is not something that is easy to do, and you cannot do it without the help of the Lord.
That's right.
And number two, what I've learned is that God works on me as I try to be more like him.
That's right.
And to that point, if we try to, and I can't even, do you realize there are things that you've done and asked forgiveness for? God doesn't remember them, and you don't either.
Wow.
And you're talking about trying to count up how much grace I've used. It's impossible. It's funny because, throughout the day or whatever, as we work, there are some times where I have to stop and appreciate God for his grace and mercy, because I've totally forgotten something that I did, something that I said that wasn't right, but a situation will trigger it. And, you get to thinking about how crazy of a decision you made when you may have been younger or less mature. You get to thinking about how you didn't heed wise counseling, but God still kept you covered. You may have went through something bad, but it could have been worse. I was speaking with my father the other day, and we were talking about, how's everything going? We were talking, and I was having a rough day. I was fighting not to say anything. And he said, I know you could complain some. I said, you know what, Pop, you're right. I said, but it's someone begging, pleading with God to be where I'm at right now. Why would I complain? Why would I complain? And that's all. I don't say that to boast or brag, but that's all a product of his grace, because I don't deserve to be where I'm at. And here's something to think about. In the equation of redemption, grace is the greatest factor.
Yeah.
In the equation of redemption, grace is the greatest factor. And you talk about tallying up how much grace we use and how we distribute grace. I think about it like this. God's grace is like receiving a blank check from a wealthy benefactor. That's guaranteed to never run out.
Yeah.
And we hoard it as if the more we give, the less we'll have. But he's already given us enough.
Buckets and droplets.
Oh,
we get it in buckets, and we give it in droplets.
And you know how much the world is in need of grace and mercy and empathy and love. And like Melvin said, compassion, mercy, and action. Scripture says in Romans, the whole earth is groaning for the adoption to take place.
Yeah.
We've been adopted. He's given us every right to his name, every right to everything he's provided. And the whole world is waiting for the adoption to take place, for the sons of God to show up. And how do we show up?
Mm.
By offering his grace, by offering his mercy, by letting people know, you know what, you messed up. And in some instances, whether it's something you didn't know about, or whether it's something you sat down and planned and decided to do, God is still here, and God can still clean you up. And God, guess what? God has a place for you in his family. And guess what? The way you see God is through me. So I'm going to show you who he is.
Everybody is, hitting on some major points. And the thing that I look at is, and Melvin touched on it, grace is really the area we as believers struggle in probably the most as we mature in our walk, right? Because, decades ago, when we had the little bracelets, the WWJD bracelets and all that kind of stuff, and today, what would Jesus do? Well, we get to a point where, in a situation where we normally would cuss, Jesus don't cuss, so we don't cuss no more. We get to a place where if we had a bad temper and we used to knock somebody out, we don't knock them out no more. We get that. But when we got to get to that place to where literally, like, we're giving grace in situations where it really doesn't have anything to do with us. And that is hard to do. Like, we talk about it, but it's hard for us to do and that's where we really need everything has to work together. We got to stay prayed up. We got to, we need the Holy Ghost. We need the discernment. We need everything all wrapped in one to do it. But really, to really pattern our thought process after what would Jesus do when it comes to that grace, because grace and forgiveness, let's just call it one big bucket. Let's call it one big
what it is
silo. You know what I mean? Some stuff when it comes to the what would Jesus do, some of that stuff after a certain point, that's kind of elementary. We get to, but like when you're talking about grace, it's levels to this thing. It's you want PhD dissertation type coursework with grace. You know what I mean? You don't get no little certificate for this. Like, you got to put in some time and some study because you're constantly going to be tested.
Oh yeah.
We are constantly going to be tested on it. And so we got to keep that mindset. It's bigger than just a little bracelet or the little fish that we used to put them on the car with the WWJD and all that. But like literally thinking, what would Jesus do in this situation? Like, how would he think? How would he operate? How would he give up?
It's because our methods are finite. We're limited in our options. We're limited by our minds. And this is why we have to tap into him. This is when we talk about grace shouldn't become a crutch. When you're reaching in your pocket, handing someone something, and it becomes a crutch. God has so many diverse ways of extending grace in our lives. And we were talking before the show came on that sometimes we may not even realize it for a year, 2 years, and we look back in the situation we were describing where, my man saying, hey, we ain't been on a plane in 2.5 years because of the pandemic, where before then we was constantly in and out of town because of business. But there were situations that materialized, but God's grace allowed the family to be intact, allowed the family to be in place during this situation. And you when you're going through it, when you're living it, sometimes you don't recognize it. So when we're talking about extending grace, we're bound by our minds. It's finite in that regard. Whereas God has limitless ways to extend us grace and to show us grace.
Something.
We have to tap into it. We have to ask, Lord, what does grace look like for this person? What does my grace look like I'm extending this person.
And you know something, you all remember Jim Baker, right? When he was, had his whole thing, and he got caught up in some stuff and he went to jail or whatever. He got interviewed in jail, by an evangelist, and the evangelist asked him a question, and Jim Baker said that, something, this was the grace of God that I got put in jail, that I got caught. Wow. This is God's grace. God allowed this to happen because he was having mercy upon me. So when we start talking about grace, it has to be about God. There may be times where we don't understand his methods. There may be times where we don't understand, when it looked like to us on the outside that is bad, but something, it could be God's grace. It could be God having mercy upon us. And then once you start looking at it through that kind of a lens, wow, grace, it has to be about God, because, nobody in their regular mind would think that going to jail, getting locked up is God's grace. But he said that God allowed this to happen so that I can see him better. I was not acknowledging him like I should. I was allowing myself, I was allowing my situation and self and my image to get the better of me. And God said no. And God allowed me to get caught, and put in jail for this time. So I appreciate and I love God because he had mercy upon my life.
And it hit different when grace doesn't show up in its pretty form.
Yeah.
We like the grace that bails us out of a situation, but sometimes the grace that allows us to still experience some pain, but not at the level that we should have experienced it. That hits a little different. You know what I mean? I'm sure Jim, it took him a minute to get to that point of realization. I'm sure he didn't. I'm sure initially when they locked him up, he didn't come. He had some time to sit in that thing.
Yeah.
But in retrospect, it still could have been much worse. You know what I mean? But it's different. Grace doesn't always show up in a pretty basket. It's not. It can show up kind of bloody sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's because sometimes that grace, in that process that you're in at that time, in that season, is preparation for where God is taking you next.
Exactly.
So it has to be pain. There's pain in the promise. There's suffering in the promise. There's pain when God is preserving you for something. And those lessons, they do hit a little bit different. So it's all relevant, man. But I tell you what, one of the things I was thinking about while you guys were talking was, again, going back to forgiveness, it's all one bucket. And a lot of times God is looking to move us into the next season of our lives. And we're bringing baggage from the last season into that season, because now we're making it run concurrently when it should be running consecutively, because you brought the emotions, you brought the unforgiveness into this season of your life, and God is moving you past that. So it's a lot, man. It's definitely a lot to this thing. Like you said, there's levels. There's so many different levels.
It's interesting that you would put it that way, because like going from one level to the next level and bringing things with you, right? And it's interesting because sometimes in my own experience, sometimes what you bring, it's like sitting in your favorite chair. It's like sitting in a recliner that you done worn out. it dips just right. It could be tattered, it could be cracked, or whatever got duct tape on it. But because that's your place of comfort, you bring it with you. But I don't think any of us in our right mind, if we're going to a new house, we want to put that right you don't want to put that there, because the mindset is you're going to a new house, so new furniture is needed. But what my mind went to is the Apostle Paul, in Corinthians, where he talks about the thorn in the flesh that was given to him, the messenger of Satan to buffet him, to challenge him, so that he wouldn't be exalted above measure. And he's like, look, I prayed to God 3 times. I'm like, God, take this thing away from me, man. You called me to do all this stuff. You called me to be a leader. You changed the whole trajectory of my life. The people who I was going out killing and dragging out houses and making public examples of them. Now you're calling me to serve them. And by the way, I'm not just serving these people, but you're sending me to people that aren't your quote unquote chosen people to deliver this message of redemption. And you done gave me this thorn in the flesh. And it'd be much easier for me, Lord, not to serve you with this thorn. Please take it out.
Right.
But what's God's response? Yeah, I know you got it, but guess what? My grace is sufficient, because my strength is made perfect in your weaknesses. And so he says, so now I'm just going to glory in the fact that I have these weaknesses, in the fact that I have these situations going. The fact that I have this thorn is a reason for me now to rejoice. Why? Because the thorn is an access to the grace of God. It's his grace that becomes my sufficiency. And many times God calls for us to go to different levels to fulfill purpose, but we can't go without the thorn. But the thorn is not an excuse for us to remain comfortable. The thorn is an excuse for us, is a reason for us to keep moving, to experience a greater level of God's grace.
Wow.
And when you touch on that particular point in the Bible with the thorn, the thing that there's some translation, they'll say that his grace is enough, but it really reads his grace is sufficient. And there's a difference between his grace being enough and his grace being sufficient. Enough says I just don't feel the pain of the thorn anymore. Or sufficient says there's some other stuff that comes with that. There's some other levels of comfort. There's some other benefits that comes with that. In addition to the fact that I don't feel this, I'm able to operate at a level as if the thorn didn't exist at all. So there's a difference. And so when we talk about his grace being sufficient, you're right. It gives us access. So he embraces it, because it's like, as long as I got this thorn, I know I got access to a whole lot to a bounty of benefits.
Right.
Given time, because his grace is sufficient.
Right.
Wow.
Well, fellas, this is it's a good time to go ahead and end this podcast right here. It's another good one. Orlando, before we cut off, just read about 3 more of those questions so we can, so we can go ahead and have these questions in our minds for our next podcast.
So in dealing with unforgiveness, are you occupying space in your life with hurt and pain that God wants to fill with joy and peace?
Okay.
Are you allowing the hurt to stop your healing?
Okay.
Are you allowing your pain to delay your promise? Is your lack of success tied to your lack of forgiveness? And I'm going to put this right here too. We're reminded, and Melvin, we touched on this last week. If you come to the altar to give your offering and you remember that your brother has aught against you, you got to go back and take care of that thing. Are we giving in vain?
Ooh.
Is your gift being is your lack of forgiveness stopping your gift from going forward? Is your lack of forgiveness stopping the windows of heaven from being opened up on you?
All right, man. Well,
you gotta stop Orlando. Orlando finna tune up. He done
right.
I'm
right.
looking around for some of them flags we have. I can't find them.
The last one, Melvin. Has your unforgiveness placed you in spiritual incarceration and halted God's blessings for your life?
Well, I'm just going to say this to our listening audience. We are going to hit these questions in our next podcast. Okay. I want you all to, like and subscribe, to our channel, please, so we can, get us in this algorithm so we can, build this. If you all think that this can help somebody, please, send them our way. Everybody is invited, because we're having these conversations just to help some people. We are, as Don said in the beginning, we're just sitting here just talking about, the goodness of God and what it takes to be real men in this world. And real men have to be able to extend grace. We have to be able to even receive grace. So we thank you all for tuning in. We thank you all for just taking the time to listen to our podcast. And hopefully you got something out of this. Please, as I said before, like and subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you all next time. Y'all take care. God bless you.
God bless.